This is Globbins, my juicy action shooter roguelite game that I submitted to the Game Maker's Toolkit 2024 Game Jam. It placed 151st overall and 26th in the enjoyment category out of over 7,500 entries. This is one of my favorite jam entries yet, and it seemed to be almost universally well received by players. How did I do it? Let's dive in. The theme for this jam was Built to Scale. Participants were given 4 days to make a game from scratch in accordance with this theme. There are straightforward interpretations of the theme. For example, a puzzle platformer where you scale parts of the level to solve the puzzles. However, I wanted to make a combat-oriented game. I settled on an idea where you, as the player, need to change your character's size to defeat waves of enemies. Before I decided exactly how that would work, I grabbed a color palette from LowSpec, started sketching a basic player and enemy, and put those into Godot. I find that getting started early on art and core mechanics helps me further develop the idea rather than trying to develop the idea all at once in my head. Given the low-resolution pixelated nature of the game, smoothly scrolling between variable sizes was not an option. I needed to draw a new player sprite for each size, so I settled on 3 player sizes: small, medium, and large. I then drew up the medium player sprite and weapon to match. The next step was to draw the final player size, which was the large player. Instead of giving all the player sizes ranged attacks, I opted to give the large player a giant hammer for melee attacks. Of course, what fun is a game where enemies don't move? Behold, enemy movement. Oh, and I added bullet collision and enemy health so that the enemies could be destroyed. The next big thing to tackle was swapping player sizes. I decided on a mechanic where the player cannot damage enemies except for enemies of a matching size. So, for example, the small player character could only damage small enemies, the medium player character could only damage medium enemies, and so on. I actually struggled a bit with how to approach changing the player character sizes. The problem was that each distinct player character size had its own movement speed, its own attack patterns, its own visuals, and also its own hitboxes. And also, I was going to add unique abilities for each player size in the future, but we'll get to that. I was torn between creating a separate scene or object for each size and stuffing each of the unique player size behaviors into a single player scene and script. I set that tricky issue aside and started streaming. By the way, hit that notification bell to be notified when I'm streaming. There will be many more streams in the near future. I didn't want to spend too much time on art, so my enemies were the same size as the player but red. They also just had bald heads in contrast to the player's hat, which was my way of better distinguishing the player and enemies. During the stream, I expanded the combat by creating enemy scenes for each enemy size and giving the large player a hammer swing ability, which could damage enemies a short distance in front of it. And finally, I decided that I would simply stuff all the disparate player functionality into a single scene and script. But to facilitate this, I needed a way to manage state comfortably. So I took a state machine I wrote in my Godot utilities library, which is open source by the way, and translated it to GDScript. This callable state machine script is linked in the description if you'd like to use it. Armed with a way of managing state more effectively, I got to work creating the various states for each of the player sizes. It was at this point I also began introducing the unique abilities for each player size. The small player size got a dash ability, and the medium player got a stick of dynamite, which is pretty cool. For the large player, I wanted a really nice jump slam ability, because hammers and jump slam go better together than Godot and Firebelly. I'll spare you the boring and finicky details of getting this to work, but here's the jump slam. This video is sponsored by me. If you want to learn how to make a complete game in Godot 4, check out my Udemy course. The link for that is in the description below. I then wanted to add more mechanically to the game. What better way to do that than a roguelite style upgrade system, where you get to choose between 3 upgrades after every wave of enemies. Instead of making the upgrades generic number increases, I wanted most of the upgrades to feel like they made a real difference in how the game played. In order to do so, I had to create upgrades for each of the 3 distinct sizes, meaning that each upgrade would only be applicable to one specific player size. One of the first roguelite style upgrades I made was what I called Jump Echo, which is where the jump slam's area damage repeats 1 additional time. This was actually really simple to implement, but it had a huge impact on the fun of the game. Upgrades are useless though if you can't select them, so I created a bare bones upgrade selection screen that occurs after each wave. One problem that was occurring to me as I was developing the game was that since the player could only damage enemies of the same size as the player, that effectively left the player with no ways of dealing with the other sizes. I thought that maybe a knockback mechanic would solve this problem, where knockback could be applied to every enemy size regardless of the player's size. The knockback could be used to interrupt enemy attacks, giving the player a tool to protect themselves from all enemy sizes. The game started to feel really good after introducing this knockback change. I didn't actually have any enemy attacks before I added knockback, but that was the immediate next thing I added. Enemy attacks consisted of a short wind-up period before they dashed at the player. If they collided with the player during that dash, the player would receive damage, which also wasn't implemented yet at that point. But it was time for a break from pesky gameplay mechanics. I fired up a stream and I focused almost exclusively on art and polish elements. I added art for the combat arena, as well as a tiling and scrollable background. Of course, I also needed to add particles. Lots and lots of particles. So many particles that I wanted the arena to be absolutely painted if you destroyed many enemies at once. I added a little camera shake as the cherry on top, and afterward the game started to feel really great to play. By this point, the game was more or less feature complete. I just needed to fill out the content and finish up the polish. I added proper upgrade card art and animation, and a game UI for showing the player health, wave time, and ability cooldowns. I also focused on combat feel by adding smearing for the large player character hammer attack, and squash and stretch animation for the medium and small player guns. And I added animations for player size switching and animations for player and enemy movement. I then added a game over screen, button art, more particles, and even more particles. The game was nearing completion and I had roughly 24 hours left until the submission time. I took this opportunity to stream the creation of a boss, which appeared on the 10th wave. This boss swapped sizes from small, medium to large after a random amount of time. After a size swap, the boss summoned a random number of enemies of the same size. I gave the boss its own health bar and a ton of health to match, and the boss was complete. The remaining time was spent adding menus and sound effects. I added a main menu, an options menu, and a pause menu. I simultaneously added sound effects for the relevant in-game events, like enemy impact and death. This was all pretty straightforward, so I won't go into many details on that. On the morning of the day of submission, I had about 6 hours to finish up any gameplay tweaks and final polish elements. I found a groovy track on Free Music Archive and added that to the game. I tweaked some numbers, did a lot of playtesting, and added some final UI elements. And with that, the game was done. I thoroughly enjoyed making Globins. I personally think it's one of my best jam entries yet. You can try the game out by visiting the link in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and subscribe for more devlog content to come. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, be sure to like and subscribe. You can wishlist Gunforged on Steam, and if you want to learn how to build a 2D survivor style game in Godot 4, you could check out my Udemy course. To stay up to date with my content, you can sign up for my newsletter at firebelly.com. Links for all of that are in the description below.